Annoyingly, we don't get every top-tier Android device in every region across the globe, and while there are problems, I have to say the Vivo X300 Ultra is a prime example of why Samsung really needs to start upping its game with future releases. But let's get into it in this video. If you want more comparisons and teardowns of what is available in the Android space, then stick around by hitting that subscribe button. I'd love to have you join the crew, and it helps me out more than you know. Cheers. So Vivo has set out to build out the best mobile imaging system possible. They've been doing it for a few years now, and then they've ended up slapping an elite level Android phone on top of it. I think if you have even a passing interest in technology, this could be one of the most interesting devices of the year you maybe hadn't necessarily heard of or been aware of. One thing that struck me right away though is how the Vivo X300 Ultra is, well, it's less concerned with the camera being a frankly massive component of its design. It literally is baked into it. And I respect that. Vivo isn't trying to do anything groundbreaking. This is an unashamed camera phone, and that means a big old bump at the back. Meanwhile, when we compare to the Samsung Galaxy S26 Ultra, they continue to use that annoying strip at the back, which I will say I personally don't mind, but it makes it wobbly face up on a table, preventing some accessories as well from connecting correctly and working well at all. Is quite plain, I think, but in the most Samsung way possible. You might not want something so out there, which is understandable, and that is absolutely fine. But the Vivo X300 Ultra goes toe-to-toe with basically any of the best phones on the market, and that does include the Galaxy S26 Ultra, where I think this phone is positioned directly against in specific markets. It's a very premium phone with, I think, a superb display, great haptics, and that undeniable heft that you get with premium products. There are many reasons you might pick one of these phones over the other from a design perspective, but it's hard not to be impressed at Vivo's lack of holding back here on this device. There are almost no areas where the company has made a major compromise. Their MO has been just throw the kitchen sink at a design and hope it all sticks. In that regard, it feels like a throwback to the early days of Android when brands just tried things. The difference is we know what makes a good device now, and I have to say they've absolutely nailed it. While Samsung does continue to pump out beautifully crafted hardware, it's impressive how well these two stack up given their price discrepancies. There's quite a big discrepancy as well. I've read many complaints about the S26 Ultra's display. I must admit I was not able to see these issues before and shortly after launch myself, but I love the display. It isn't as good as the S25 Ultra though. Now I've started to see the complaints people have had about it. The Vivo X300 Ultra does have a very good screen of its own, but even though the Galaxy S26 Ultra isn't as good as its own predecessor, I do think it's still clearly above the X300 in terms of the actual screen quality. And as I say, this is a camera phone. This is a camera phone designed to take the best photos, and simply put, the Vivo X300 Ultra, and I don't say this lightly, is the best camera system I've ever used on a smartphone. It is like carrying a mirrorless camera that can also serve a B cam in 90 to 95% of video shooting environments if you're a video shooting person, as well as having that excellent stills quality as well. You could easily ditch this for some rigs if you're willing to make some compromises that come with using a smartphone. That's before we get into the additional lens kits and rigging options that can be added to this phone to increase the capabilities. I haven't even been able to scratch the surface of the extra photographer kit, as I feel in some ways this isn't what the average buyer will ever consider, but it is a big bonus selling point, something that if you only want to carry a phone, you might want to look at. And these are exceptional extra pieces of technology that can be slapped to the back of this phone. Samsung used to lead and try and lead in the mobile camera space. And you can see, comparing to this, that this hasn't been the case for a number of years. The differences here are so stark that I have to say I'm going to be disappointed going back to the S26 Ultra when the time comes. The only saving grace is that Vivo has backloaded that camera system, and this means that the selfie camera is merely okay in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to the best in the business. It is a major step down compared to those, and it's obvious that this was an area of corner cutting to make everything else work at the back, which I can kind of take this downgrade because, as I say, the X300 Ultra needs to be used as a true camera nerd's dream phone to experience all of it. Throw in the Zeiss lens tuning, the filter options, and I think there is a gaping chasm between how good the Vivo X300 Ultra camera is versus how limited, which is, and that's not a light term that I'm using there, the Galaxy S26 Ultra camera starts to feel. It's night and day difference, and it proved that Samsung has kind of resting on its laurels for a number of years now when it comes to the camera system. My biggest gripe with the Vivo X300 Ultra, though, is in its software experience. Frankly, it's subpar when compared to what Samsung has been doing with One UI in recent years. Vivo calls its version of Android 16 Origin OS 6, and while I do think it is far from the worst offender for making Android feel like an iOS knockoff, it isn't without lots of faults of its own. There are lots of features here to delve into, which I love, almost too many in some ways, but I think the structure of those is not in keeping with other Android phones that you're used to. So you might head into the settings application and find that certain common functions are not where you expect them to be, and it often takes a little while to get used to where they are and how to get around on this phone. I often just fall back on using the search option to get where I need to go, which is fine, but yeah, it's not necessarily the best if you are an Android user switching to another Android phone. What's more, for me, I think the visual identity, well, let's be honest, it's absolutely non-existent here. You're caught between iOS Lite with liquid glass, and then there's dynamic colour with little to no Material 3 Expressive thrown in. The quick settings controls feel like a step back to the Android 11 era, and I don't mean in a good way, which some of you might like, but I think it feels like a throwback that actually ages experience because you're having so many things thrown at the wall and they don't all stick at the same time. One UI 8.5 has some irksome elements of its own that do skirt a fine line between iOS and iOS homage, but I think it's just more cohesive, it's cleaner, and most importantly, operates much more smoothly. This is one of the key areas where I do think Chinese device makers like Vivo need to start catching up with others in the space, as it hinders otherwise exceptional smartphones, in some cases by having an experience that feels at odds with the rest of Android and the Android marketplace. Sure, the picture has brightened in recent years, but it remains a thorn in the side of many OEMs, and it's very, very apparent when using the Vivo X300 Ultra. If you want the best software experience, granted the performance is almost identical on these, at least in my experience, then yeah, the Vivo isn't necessarily the best option out there right now. One of the few hardware-related areas where Samsung and the Samsung Galaxy S26 Ultra manages to hang in with the Vivo X300 Ultra is somewhat surprisingly, in my experience, the battery longevity. Despite having a 30% smaller 5,000 mAh internal cell versus the Vivo's 6,600 mAh battery, haven't actually seen any major lifespan gains with the larger internal cell. I think some of the software enhancements in One UI help achieve similar day-to-day longevity. Extrapolating this out a little, it does mean that Samsung has an opportunity with future releases to get a better battery experience, and that is something that I would absolutely love to see. I think the 100-watt wired charging also is impressive and it's super fast, but it isn't a big enough leap over the S26 Ultras. I think it's 65-watt charging. I'll correct that on screen if I'm wrong there. That's pretty fast in its own right, and I think that's pretty much good enough for most people. This does show, though, that it's how you utilize the internals rather than just throwing every specification under the sun more than anything else. Something that we can all agree that Samsung is excellent at doing with their devices is optimization. And yes, the optimizations are working with the S26 Ultra. It isn't the longest lasting, but it hangs in there with the larger cells of this Vivo device in particular. In essence, there are a few brands coming out of China that have and will continue to just throw insane things at the wall and try to push boundaries in the mobile space. And when you hear people say, I've said this myself, that smartphones are getting boring or we've hit a plateau, I think this is where we all get proven wrong. The downside is that Samsung pays little attention to what brands like Vivo and Xiaomi and Oppo are doing with their devices over in China. You would kind of think that the Korean tech brand would look at what the Galaxy S26 Ultra does and what a device like the Vivo X300 Ultra is capable of and, well, feel ashamed. Instead, they simply stopped competing, or at least trying to push boundaries in the same way that they did in the early days. And there's too much looking at what Apple are doing rather than what others in their own space are doing as to how Samsung is approaching their own hardware. When I use the Galaxy S26 Ultra, at least now that I've used the Vivo X300 Ultra, there is a real sense of inadequacy. I think it's a very good product, overshadowed by some other risk takers trying to move the needle at a time when phones have felt the same for a while. It's just a shame that not everyone will have the opportunity to consider a device such as the X300 Ultra. Let's hope, though, that that changes very soon in the future. But that is the Galaxy S26 Ultra compared directly to arguably one of the best phones I have tried this year so far. I'm very excited to get into more phones like this and just experiment with Android again. Let me know what you think down in the comment sections below. I'm intrigued to see how people feel about devices such as this. It is a very hardware-focused device, and some of the other aspects of it definitely need a little bit of tuning, but they can get there in the long term. The lack of availability is another big annoyance, but you can import these if you wish. I wouldn't necessarily suggest that, but yeah. Interesting time for Android, especially when our biggest player isn't pushing boundaries like some of the regional options that are available to them. As I say, let me know what you think down in the comment sections below. And if you're intrigued in hardware like this, we'll try and do a few more videos comparing the best of Android from the rest of the world to what we have in every single region. Cheers for watching though, and I'll speak to you later.